There's a human skull that, at least on the surface, shouldn't exist. It was uncovered in the desert of southern Peru, dry, remarkably preserved, almost eerily still. At a glance, nothing seems unusual. Bone structure, age, proportions. It all reads as human, or close enough. But then, you notice the shape. It's elongated, more than what you'd expect from cultural practices like head binding. And yes, that practice did exist. The Paracas culture, among others, intentionally reshaped infant skulls for status or identity. That part is well established. Still, this feels different. The skull is longer, heavier. The back extends in a way that doesn't quite align with typical anatomy. And then there's the detail that tends to unsettle people. Where you'd expect 3 cranial plates, there appear to be only 2. That alone raises questions. For a long time, the standard explanation held up reasonably well. Cranial deformation can produce dramatic shapes. Museums labeled the skulls accordingly, and for decades, that seemed sufficient. But the more closely you look, the more that explanation starts to strain. Deformation changes outward form. It doesn't usually rewrite internal structure. It shouldn't remove a cranial plate. It shouldn't increase cranial volume by something like 20 to 25%. Bone density, too, isn't typically affected in that way. And yet, in some of these skulls, those differences appear to be present. So you're left with an uncomfortable possibility. Either our assumptions about these practices are incomplete, or something else is going on. Back in 1928, Julio Tello uncovered hundreds of these skulls in the Paracas Peninsula. The burial site itself suggested a complex, organized society. Nothing chaotic or anomalous about it, at least culturally. But even then, there were hints that not all of these skulls were shaped after birth. Some seem to have developed this way naturally. That's where things start to shift. For decades, the remains sat in collections, categorized and largely set aside. It wasn't until more recent advances, particularly in genetic testing, that new questions emerged. Because now we can examine DNA directly. And DNA, for better or worse, doesn't really accommodate convenient explanations. It either aligns or it doesn't. When testing was first proposed, most expected confirmation. These were human remains, perhaps with unusual cultural modifications. Nothing more. But the results didn't quite settle things. Some sequences didn't match known human patterns, at least not cleanly. In certain regions, the differences were difficult to ignore. At first, researchers suspected contamination. That would make sense. Ancient samples are fragile, easily compromised. But if the data holds, then we're left with a more complicated question. What exactly are we looking at? Because if these skulls don't fit neatly into the human genetic map, then it's possible, just possible, that they belong to something we haven't fully accounted for. And that's where the story starts to become less comfortable and more open-ended. At first, the reaction from the scientific community was fairly predictable. When something doesn't quite fit, the instinct is usually to place it somewhere familiar, reshape the problem until it makes sense. That's more or less what happened here. The Paracas skulls were grouped under cranial deformation, a practice we already understand reasonably well. Different cultures around the world shaped infant skulls while the bone was still soft, binding, pressing, guiding growth into specific forms. The results could look extreme, even unsettling, but still human. So the explanation felt sufficient. These were human remains, altered by tradition. Nothing unusual beyond that. But the more closely researchers examined the skulls, the less comfortable that conclusion became. Deformation, after all, has limits. It affects the outer shape, yes, but it doesn't typically alter the underlying structure. Sutures remain where they should be. Cranial plates don't just disappear. And yet, in several Paracas skulls, they seem to. The sagittal suture, the line that usually runs along the top of the skull, is in some cases simply not there. Not fused or worn down. Just missing. Then there's the size. These skulls aren't just elongated. They appear to have a noticeably larger cranial volume, sometimes estimated at up to 25% more than an average human skull. That starts to feel less like cosmetic change and more like something biological, perhaps even developmental, which raises a different kind of question. If this wasn't purely the result of cultural modification, then what were these individuals like before any shaping occurred? One possibility researchers considered was genetic anomaly, a rare mutation, or perhaps a cluster of developmental conditions, could, at least in theory, produce unusual skull growth. That idea isn't unreasonable. Human biology does allow for variation, but it doesn't fully resolve the scale of what was found. We're not talking about one or two isolated cases. The Paracas site contained hundreds of these skulls. That suggests a population, not an accident. And populations tend to follow inherited patterns. So the focus gradually shifted from cultural practice to lineage, which is where genetics comes in. When DNA was finally extracted, researchers looked at mitochondrial DNA, since it traces maternal ancestry quite reliably. If these individuals were fully human, their sequences should align with known haplogroups, the genetic markers that map how humans spread across Africa, Eurasia, and the Americas. There's a structure to it, a kind of genetic map. But the results didn't entirely match that map. Some markers didn't align with any recognized human haplogroup. Not African, not European, not Asian, not Native American. They didn't clearly point anywhere. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Minor anomalies, maybe degradation. But as more samples were analyzed, the inconsistencies became harder to ignore. Certain segments appeared so unusual that they didn't cleanly match humans, or even known primates. And that creates a quiet problem. Because evolution, as we understand it, is continuous. There aren't supposed to be abrupt breaks, no branches appearing without a traceable origin. Yet this began to look like one. Naturally, interpretations started to diverge. Some researchers questioned the data itself, contamination, errors, misreads. Others leaned toward the idea of unknown human diversity, populations we haven't fully mapped yet. But a smaller group started asking a more uncomfortable question. Not where these skulls belong, but whether they belong in the human framework at all. Once that idea was said out loud, it didn't really go away. What if these skulls don't sit neatly inside the human family tree? What if they're slightly outside it? It's the kind of question scientists tend to approach carefully, maybe even avoid at first. Not because it's impossible, but because it pushes against the framework everything else relies on. So, naturally, more grounded explanations came first. One of the more conservative ideas is that this could be an unknown human subgroup, something like a distant branch that developed in isolation. We've seen that before with Neanderthals and Denisovans, entire populations, living alongside early humans, then fading out. So it's not unreasonable to imagine the Paracas people fitting into that pattern. Different, yes, but still part of the same broader story. The issue is, even those ancient groups still share clear genetic overlap with us. You can trace it. There's continuity. Here, that continuity seems less obvious, which brings up another possibility: extreme mutation. Maybe this wasn't a separate lineage at all, but a population shaped by unusual genetic conditions over many generations. Skull growth, bone density, even certain DNA expressions could have shifted in ways that now look unfamiliar. It's plausible, at least on paper. But mutations tend to come with trade-offs: instability, health issues, reduced survival over time. It's hard to reconcile that with what we see at Paracas: a structured society, deliberate burials, signs of continuity. This doesn't look like a fragile population struggling to persist. So there's a third idea, one that people mention more quietly: that this might represent a lineage that split off earlier than we assume. Not quite Homo sapiens, but not entirely separate either. Something that diverged before our species fully took shape. A kind of parallel line. It sounds speculative, maybe even a bit uncomfortable. Still, evolution isn't always tidy. It doesn't guarantee that every branch leaves behind clear evidence. And if multiple human-like groups once existed, it's possible some traces were lost or absorbed. That shifts the perspective a bit. These skulls stop looking like isolated curiosities and start to feel more like fragments of a larger, incomplete picture. Of course, theories only go so far. What researchers really needed was better data, something cleaner, more controlled, and eventually, that came with newer genetic analysis methods. More precise sequencing, stricter lab conditions, fewer chances for contamination. This time, expectations were cautious. No assumptions, just verification. If earlier results were flawed, this would fix them. If they weren't, then things might get complicated, and they did. Because the updated data didn't resolve the inconsistencies. It sharpened them. Some DNA segments didn't just look unusual. They appeared unclassifiable. Not degraded, not partial, just not matching anything we currently recognize. Which leads to a different kind of question. Not what is this, but how something like this can exist at all without a clear place in the genetic record. The expectation, at least early on, was fairly straightforward. Better tools would clean things up. More precise sequencing, less contamination. Finally, a clear answer that puts everything back in order. But that's not quite what happened. As independent labs started reanalyzing the samples, mitochondrial DNA, fragments of nuclear DNA, everything was handled carefully. Controlled environments, repeated tests, detailed documentation. The idea was simple. If earlier results were flawed, this would expose it. Yet the inconsistencies didn't disappear. Some parts of the sequences aligned with human DNA well enough. There was a recognizable pattern, something familiar. And then, unexpectedly, that pattern would break. Entire segments diverged in ways that didn't seem to fit within normal mutation ranges. Not just unusual, more like out of place. The kind of variation you wouldn't expect within a single species, or even between closely related ones. It almost looked as if one portion of the genome followed a human template, while another didn't quite belong to anything we've cataloged. Not clearly primate, not clearly animal, just unclassified. And in genetics, that term isn't used lightly. Our databases are extensive, modern populations, ancient remains, even extinct species. When something doesn't match, it's usually because the DNA is too degraded to read properly. But here, the sequences in question weren't degraded. They were stable, repeated across tests. Which leaves a more uncomfortable possibility. We're looking at something that isn't in the record. Some researchers tried to frame this within known mechanisms. Ancient admixture, for example. Interbreeding between early humans and an unknown archaic group. After all, modern humans still carry Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA. That part is well established. So maybe this was something similar, just less understood. The problem is, admixture tends to leave a trail. You can usually trace where those genetic fragments came from. There's a reference point, even if it's incomplete. Here, there doesn't seem to be one. No clear origin, no baseline for comparison. It's a bit like finding a text written in a language that doesn't resemble any known linguistic family. That's when a quieter idea starts to surface. Not that these individuals came from somewhere else in the obvious sense, but that something unfamiliar may have entered the human line much earlier than we realize. Subtle enough to remain hidden, until it appears more clearly in a population like Paracas, a kind of genetic residue from something we no longer recognize. If that's even partially true, the focus shifts. It's no longer just about unusual skulls. It's about inheritance itself. What exactly are we carrying in our DNA? And how much of it do we actually understand? I remember thinking, looking at this kind of data, that it stops feeling like an anomaly after a while. It starts to feel more like a gap, something missing from the story rather than something extra. Imagine having a complete genome mapped out, every sequence accounted for, and then noticing a section that doesn't quite fit. Not damaged, not obviously foreign, just unexplained. That's roughly what this suggests, not definitive proof of anything extraordinary, but maybe a hint that the picture we have is incomplete. And once you consider that, it becomes harder to assume we fully understand where we come from. There's a kind of quiet that settles in once all the data is laid out. No headlines, no clear conclusions, just sequences on a screen, and a sense that something isn't quite adding up, because the Paracas skulls don't really confirm a single, tidy explanation. If anything, they seem to resist one. You can measure everything: bone structure, cranial volume, DNA sequences, and still be left with gaps. Not dramatic ones, but enough to feel unresolved. Science tends to assume that, given time, most anomalies will eventually make sense, that they're temporary, waiting for better tools or better context. And often, that's true. But every so often, something doesn't shrink under scrutiny. It stays where it is, forcing you to adjust your expectations instead. This might be one of those cases. What's interesting is that the skulls don't necessarily give us a new answer. They point to a question we may have overlooked. For a long time, the working assumption has been fairly simple. Humanity has a single origin story. Different cultures, different appearances, but ultimately, one continuous line. The Paracas evidence doesn't exactly break that idea, but it does seem to complicate it. Not in an obvious way. More like a quiet suggestion that the story might be less linear than we thought. That at some point, there could have been divergence, not just culturally, but biologically. If that's even partly true, then human starts to feel less like a fixed definition, and more like something we're still trying to pin down. I find that's where it becomes personal. It's one thing to look at ancient remains and debate classifications. It's another to consider what that implies about us. Imagine looking at your own DNA, billions of coded instructions, and being told that parts of it aren't fully understood, not dangerous, not dramatic, just unfamiliar. You'd still be human, of course, but the certainty around that label might shift, even if only slightly. That seems to be the quieter implication here. The Paracas skulls don't demand that we believe anything in particular. They don't offer a clear alternative either. They just remain unresolved, and maybe that's the point. Because once you accept that part of the past might be missing, history starts to feel less like a finished record and more like a reconstruction. Some pieces are well established, others are inferred, and some, quite possibly, haven't been found yet. The desert where these skulls were uncovered hasn't changed. It's still there, dry, silent, holding whatever it holds without explanation. And maybe that's the closest thing to a conclusion. Not that we found something impossible, but that we've reached a boundary in what we can currently explain. For now, at least, it stays just beyond certainty.